Broadcasting from the world headquarters of the National Floor Safety Institute is America's slip and fall guy, Russ Kenzie.
This is America's slip and fall guy, Russ Kenzie, thanking you for listening to my podcast. Oftentimes when we've been talking about slips, trips, and falls, we've been focusing on the issue primarily as it affects the United States. But why and how people fall is really impactful for the whole world. And how different countries address slips, trips, and falls is oftentimes very different. Joining me today is Christian Harris with Slip Safety Services out of the UK. Welcome, Chris.
Hi, Russ. Thanks for having me on the show.
No, thank you. A little background. How is it that you learned about the NFSI and myself, if you don't mind me asking? How did that start?
Well, I'd heard of the NFSI, and to be honest, I really started hearing of you and following you because of your podcast, if I'm honest. So it's a pleasure to be on because I've listened to all of the other episodes and found them really interesting and useful. So yeah, that was how we got together, really.
Well, thank you. I didn't know I was that big of a hit in the UK. I know we have listeners across the world, but it's good to hear from you. And it sounds like you found the podcast to be helpful or impactful.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm always I've done a few podcast appearances myself, and I'm just starting to do some video interviews, which I'm planning to do a bit of podcast with as well. So it'd be good if you could join me on one of those perhaps one day. I was searching, as I often do, for risk management, health and safety related podcasts, just stuff kind of around my area of expertise, because I'm always keen to learn more and hear what's going on in the trends, not just in slips, trips and falls, but the wider risk management piece. And your podcast came up, and so I started listening, and yeah, I found it really good. I think particularly the episode around the lady, I can't remember her name, from CNA Insurance, I thought was very interesting because I do a lot of work with insurers here in the UK. So it was useful to compare and contrast the way that they're approaching it there versus how insurers here are approaching it.
You're referring to Sherry Falkenberg, who did the study on measuring static coefficient of friction to the NFSI B101.1 standard for, I forgot how many hundreds of her companies, retail, I think it was a retailer or a restaurant chain, I forget. But the fact that they were able to correlate the higher the traction or slip resistance of a floor does in fact reveal fewer claims, meaning lower traction floors that are more slippery produce a higher number of claims than do high traction floors. In fact, I think only 13% of the injury claims that CNA Insurance had seen were occurring on floors that were ranked as high traction. Therefore, the goal would be to keep floors in the high traction range, and theoretically, you could prevent up to 87% of injuries. And it was a good study. It was done a number of years ago. It's again available on the NFSI website if you actually want to watch her speak, as well as the other speakers that were at the symposium in 2015, which is hosted by Emory University in Atlanta. We are having another symposium next year, just to let you know, which will be hosted at another university here in the States. So we'll keep you up to the speed on that. But tell the listeners a little bit about yourself, your company, how long you've been in business, and why it is you got into this business.
Sure. So as you said, my name is Christian Harris, and my business is called Slip Safety Services. Hopefully, we do what we say on the tin, if that makes sense. Essentially, we're a floor maintenance business with two key specialisms. The first is around improving and maintaining the cleanliness of the sort of grubbier end of environments like leisure clubs and kitchens and high traffic areas like shopping malls. And the second part, which is more relevant to the show, is around the prevention of particularly slips, but also trips and fall accidents. And I've been in this business for over 10 years now in terms of working in this field. The current business is just over a couple of years old, but I've been working in this field for just over a decade. And I think in terms of getting involved, it was something before this, I was working as a management consultant, so advising banks and private equity houses on whether they should invest in company A or company B, or how they could grow their portfolio company into a different country or a different region, things like that. So kind of very much commercial. So I don't come from a health and safety background. But when I was kind of looking for my next move, I became aware of this massive issue, which I know you're all too familiar with, where hundreds of thousands, millions of people were getting hurt. And it seemed like a huge problem, and there didn't really seem to be a particularly good solution there. And I wanted to be doing something kind of good in the world, if that makes sense, because lots of my friends are bankers and lawyers, and that's great, but I wanted to be doing something that would be helpful to the world at large as well. So this kind of really ticked a lot of boxes for me. There was a big problem. If we could help to solve that problem, we'd be doing some good in the world. And I felt as if there was a real opportunity to grab the bull by the horns and run forward with it.
So how big of a problem are slips, trips, and falls in the UK?
Well, I'm sure, very similar to in the US. So it's the biggest cause of people going to the accident and emergency, I guess you call it the ER in America, over 300,000 people a year. It's the biggest cause of people having overnight stays in hospital. It's the biggest cause of accident, or as you like to call it, incident, in most sectors. So if you take health clubs, for example, over a third of insurance claims are caused by slips. And then you have another almost 10% caused by trips. So that's by far and away the biggest cause of insurance claims. And in terms of costs, we have a slightly different legal system to you guys. But to give you an idea, one of the larger insurers that we work with is AXA, which is a French firm, but I think they operate pretty much throughout the world. And in the UK alone, they spend about £80 million a year on claims just for slips. So not trips, just for slips. So if you think they've got, nowhere near 10% of the market, that means that there's £1 billion or more easily just on claims being spent in the UK. So it's a big, big problem.
Now, you mentioned litigation. Here in the States, oftentimes when people are harmed as a result of a slip or trip, they'll file a lawsuit. Most of those lawsuits do not generate huge dollar amounts. In fact, it's pretty hard to win a slip and fall lawsuit. And we've had previous podcasts with both plaintiff and defense attorneys who spoke about the litigation issue here in the States, but it's different in the UK. Do people file lawsuits for a slip and fall, a trip and fall in the UK?
They do, and I think our society has become increasingly litigious over the years. I wouldn't say maybe to the same extent that certainly the stereotypical view of the US is here in the UK, but people are more apt to make a claim now than they were certainly 10 years ago when I first got involved in this world. In terms of payouts and things like that, the average cost is about £10,000. So, but we do have a lot of claims which would come in and would probably get settled with a few £100s as a sort of, sorry, here's a voucher or something like that. And then, of course, we do have some of the larger claims as well. So I've heard of several claims over £1 million, but that doesn't include any kind of element of punitive damages. So that's simply the medical costs and restoring the person back to the position they were in before the accident happened and before the claim arose. So whilst the numbers might be at the top end a lot smaller than in the States, I think probably the average of about £10,000 wouldn't be too dissimilar to what you guys see.
Wow, that's a bit surprising because most of the world tends to point to the United States as the lawsuit capital of the world, and in many cases it is, but it's not really what you think. There's most Americans that are filing a lawsuit for a slip, trip, and fall simply want their medical costs reimbursed. They're not looking to get rich. In fact, very few, if any, really pursue a lawsuit because of that. It's rather just they have a large number of expenses. And unlike the UK, where you have guaranteed medical treatment, socialized medicine, in the States, we don't. And so a property owner, a business owner has to buy, or everybody for that matter, has to buy their own insurance privately if it's not provided by their employer. And they have to deal with insurance separately from governmental control. So we don't have guaranteed health care. You have to buy your health care on the open markets, unless, again, it's provided by an employer. And then you have to buy insurance. So a company, a retailer, grocery store, which, of course, are the most likely to have a slip and fall history, they're on the markets buying insurance. So it's a little bit different, but it's interesting. Your 10,000 pound cost per incident is about the same. Here in the States, it's somewhere around $6,000 to $7,000 per claim. So it sounds very similar. And I didn't do the math, but if we were to ramp up the numbers that you just mentioned, percentage of population on how many people in the UK are seeking emergency room treatment for a fall, and compare that to the States, we're about 8 million people a year will seek emergency room treatment for an accidental fall. Now that includes all kinds of falls. Falls downstairs, people fall, off of their roofs when they're cleaning leaves or repairs. And so the number of slips and falls or trips and falls would be a subset of the 8 million incidents, but nonetheless, it's a sizable problem. And I would presume in the UK, it disproportionately affects the elderly. The elderly are the most prone to this form of injury, and certainly the vast majority of fatalities, slip and fall fatalities, are affecting the elderly. Is that what you see?
Yeah, absolutely. If you look at the hospital admissions, it certainly skews older. So 60 plus are much more likely to be going to hospital. And of course, when it comes to claim costs, because of the medical care that's needed if you slip over and break your hip if you're in your 60s versus if you slip over and sprain your wrist in your 20s, there's a massive increase in cost there. And it's something where with the population getting older and older, with the baby boomer generation and stuff, this is kind of only going to increase over the coming years, I think.
Who is your typical customer? I mean, who do you normally find yourself selling your products to?
Yeah, so we're a service-based business. So I used to be involved in a business which was kind of product-based, a bit like I think your business was, where it was kind of making products for cleaning contractors or end user customers to use to try to mitigate the risk of accidents. And when I moved across and set up my own business, I kind of decided to stick to a service model for a few reasons. But one of them was that I found over the years that you can give people great products, but you can train them to use them, but you can't actually get them to use them properly day in and day out. And therefore, we feel as if kind of trying to change the way people are operating day by day is a bit of a losing battle. So we try to kind of supplement what they're doing with kind of periodic work. But anyway, that wasn't answering your question. Just a bit of background. My typical clients, I suppose, in terms of sectors are health clubs, hotels, shopping centres, shopping malls, and then things like restaurants with kitchens and front of house, transport hubs and manufacturing facilities. They're probably the bulk of what we do. We also get involved in airports and busy places like that. And in terms of the kind of person that we are speaking with, it tends to be the health and safety director or manager would be our first port of call, because they're kind of most acutely aware of the number of incidents they're having and the issues there. But invariably, we need to get involved at some point in time with the buyer of insurance and the finance team and the procurement team and kind of the economic buyers as well.
When you say economic buyers, who are the economic buyers? Is that an insurance company? I mean, who's ultimately paying for this?
Well, with our partnerships with the insurers, we tend to find that they will part fund quite a lot of our work, certainly in terms of the investigation and assessment work at the start of the journey we go through with clients. We can often get that either fully funded or part funded through insurance risk management bursaries. But in terms of the end customer, my experience is that health and safety people don't tend to have a budget, so they'll have influence, and they can be a really great champion for what we do, or indeed any other kind of health and safety. But they don't tend to be able to say, yes, we're gonna buy this, we're gonna do this, because they need to get that signed off by somebody who tends to be, an operations director or a financial director or something like that.
So you say the insurance industry will either subsidize the cost of safety treating floors or just pay for it entirely. Is that correct?
Correct. Yeah, correct. Because if you think about it, I mean, most companies here in the UK, unless they're very, very large, would have what's known in the business as ground up insurance cover. So in other words, there'd be almost no excess to pay. Whereas once you get into being some of the big supermarkets or airports or big manufacturing facilities, they'll tend to be of the size that they can afford to take a bit more of the risk. So they'll have an excess, which might be £5,000 or £10,000, or I've even heard of £250,000. And so when you've got particularly these mid-market companies where the insurance company is basically on the hook for the whole cost of a claim, they're clearly very, very invested in trying to reduce the number and the value of any potential claims that might come in. And going back to what I said earlier, by far the largest cause of claim and by far the largest cost of claim is people slipping, tripping, and falling. So they're certainly willing, particularly where they're working with partners like us that they know, like, and trust, to put their money where their mouth is.
Wow, that's a very different approach than what takes place here in the States. The insurance industry in the U.S. generally recommends certain actions of their policyholders, training. For example, they recommend compliance with nationally recognized consensus standards like the NFSI standards. And they also encourage safety treatments, but they generally don't pay for the treatment themselves. They'll simply recommend them. And so it's a little bit different marketplace. Now, when you go out and assess a particular location, do you do any testing? Do you test the floors for slip resistance?
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, we do. So here in the UK, the HSE, which is our kind of government health and safety organisation, they stipulate that you have to use the pendulum test, which I don't think is particularly common in the US, but it's used in the UK and Australia, and so it's used in quite a few of the Commonwealth countries. So there are other tests, of course, other tribometers available in the marketplace. But if essentially, if you're going to end up in court being prosecuted, then the HSE, if it's a criminal case, is going to have pendulum test data. And so you, as the defendant or potential defendant, need to have that data available to you as well. So it's not the most, it's called a portable slip resistance test, but it's a massive piece of kit, which is quite difficult to move around, and it's fairly difficult to use. But the HSE view is that that's the most accurate test method that they feel they're happy to put their name behind.
Well, it's interesting. The pendulum device was actually invented here in the United States, I think back in the 1930s, for measuring skid resistance, primarily for roads and highways, and was really never used for measuring slip resistance of floors. There's been an evolution in the United States of testing devices dating back to the static coefficient of friction devices, all the way up to where we are today with these robotic devices, self-propelled, very technologically advanced devices which measure static and dynamic friction to the range of standards. In the United States, we don't mandate testing of floors, and in my experience, very few companies, retailers, grocery stores, hospitals will test their floors. They'll sadly wait until somebody is hurt and then sort out the details, if you will, during the lawsuit, which is kind of non-proactive, highly reactive. But testing in the United States is rare. Again, in my experience, not many companies actually test their floors. And part of the reason is if you're a very large retailer, grocery store chain, and you test the coefficient of friction of your floors and you find a deficit, well, you have to therefore do something. You have to do something about it. And so there's a certain business philosophy. I assume they teach this at Harvard and the Ivy Leagues that denial is a very powerful emotion. So if you just simply deny you have a problem, you don't test your floors, therefore you have no scientific evidence that reveals a problem, you can feel as if you're invincible and that you don't have to worry about liability, when in fact that's kind of the counterintuitive approach to injury prevention. Injury prevention is all about having advanced knowledge, having advanced warnings, preparedness. If there's a hurricane, coming towards your country and it's going to make landfall in 3 days, you want to prepare. You don't want to simply wait and say, well, that's okay. We're, as long as we have insurance, we're fine. Well, human lives are at stake, and there's some things money simply cannot buy. But it's rare, in my experience, to do any testing. Now, in the UK, you mentioned the pendulum. Is that controlled by your government? Is that mandated for use? Do companies have to test their floors? Is there any background that you can share with the pendulum and its applicability or mandated use?
Yeah, sure. So I think firstly, just to take your point about testing and proactiveness, it's kind of the same here. The challenge that I face and others in the industry, and I kind of spend a lot of time trying to educate the marketplace about this, is that if you carry on doing things the same way you've always done it, then of course you're going to get the same results. And so we know that this is a massive issue. We know there are all of these injuries taking place, and therefore we need to do something different about it. And you can't really understand the slip risk of your building without measuring the slip resistance of your floor. So trying to get people to be more proactive and say, well, look, you can't bury your head in the sand. Firstly, because you will never improve, and secondly, because actually, certainly in the courts, ignorance is no excuse. So it's all about, have you taken reasonable steps? Now, is it reasonable that you would have done a slip test if actually over the last 10 years, the majority of your accidents have been people slipping over? Well, yeah, that's reasonable, and therefore you're going to be held liable for both the civil and criminal claims in that respect. So I think that is helping to push people down that route. The pendulum obviously is what the HSE recommend. It's all that they would use in any enforcement and prosecutions. But there's no mandatory testing cycle or anything like that. It's something that I kind of am keen to try and make a bit of a campaign towards, because I feel as if certainly, perhaps not every single building in every single sector, but I think certain sectors, certain environments, really would benefit from having, say, an annual test, and that way they could try and stay on top of their risks a bit better.
Is some of the reluctance to testing coming from the fact that, as you mentioned, the pendulum is a difficult device to use? You have to presumably hire a third-party engineer or company that would have to come out with the device and set it up. I mean, it is. I've seen it used. It's an interesting device, and frankly, I'd like to learn more about it. But is it because of the complex nature and perhaps even the cost of doing the testing that you find companies reluctant to do testing?
Yeah, I think there's a few factors. So that's certainly one of the factors, is that it is quite complicated to use. So I remember when I was first trained, it still took me several times using it before I felt really confident that I was doing it properly. It's not the easiest test to actually do. Whereas there are other tests in the market that are dead simple. Press a button and it's done. So that is one of the barriers. I think the fact that effectively, therefore, you've got to get a third party to do it does introduce a barrier as well. I mean, the cost of it really does vary. So some people, and we would do this sometimes as well, would go and do a test for free, but that's typically where they're then offering some kind of solution on the back end. And the argument against doing it for free or accepting a free test is, can you necessarily take into consideration the results in the right way? Can you believe what they're saying to you? There's also something around the fact that although the test is mandated and there are standards as to how you should use it and so on and so forth, there is a group kind of similar to the NFSI called the UK Slip Resistance Group, which I'm a member of, and we kind of set down the guidelines of how to use the test and so on and so forth. But you don't have to be a member of that body to buy a pendulum and claim that you can do pendulum tests. And there's no exam you have to pass, and there's no outside of the group where we actually do round robin testing quite frequently to make sure that we're all getting very, very similar results. There's no kind of measurement of that or benchmarking. So, there's a few different challenges there. I do think, going forward, if there was a way of measuring or getting an idea of slip resistance from, your iPhone, then that's got to be the way forward, really. But I don't know that the HSE would ever necessarily accept that. But I think, there's a place for other tests, in my opinion. We're only wedded to the pendulum from the perspective of we believe that people in the UK should get that testing done as the kind of gold standard benchmark. But we would recommend other tests or other ways of monitoring to our clients so that they don't have to necessarily get a pendulum test done all the time. They can do other things themselves, which is quicker, cheaper, and easier to do on a weekly or a monthly or a quarterly basis.
Well, it's interesting you say that because we see a lot of popularity of the NFSI standards throughout the world, particularly in Europe, where many companies, we get calls from companies throughout Europe having questions about the B101.3, wet dynamic coefficient of friction standard. They're employing the use of multiple devices. Sadly, the pendulum doesn't comply with that standard because the device doesn't actually measure the dynamic coefficient of friction like the NFSI approved devices. Doesn't mean that the pendulum is not precise. It just means it's a bit different. And we're looking to actually do a correlation study with the pendulum versus some of the other DCOF devices to see how they compare. But we see a lot of popularity of NFSI standards beyond the shores of the United States. And is that something would be accepted in the UK if somebody was testing to an NFSI standard using an NFSI approved device, or would that be outside the boundaries?
I think you could certainly make an argument. I think it's all about what's reasonable and are you taking reasonable steps to try and reduce your risk. So if you're doing something that, might not necessarily be exactly the same way that the HSE would do it themselves, but you could actually stand behind it and say, well, look, this is used in X country and Y country, and it's robust for these reasons. I can't see any reason why you couldn't stand behind that, at least to a certain extent. I suspect that it would be a better and more robust way of doing it than some of the other tests that are in the market that, frankly, I don't think really measure anything at all, but are sold as all singing and all dancing alternatives to the pendulum test. So, I think, there's certainly an opportunity there to see if that could be integrated into the UK.
Well, the reason I say that, recently we received a call from the U.S. Embassy. I think it was in Germany, and they're building a new embassy there, and they rely upon the B101.3 standard. Many government agencies, government buildings, the Smithsonian, for example, they'll test their floors with an NFSI approved device, and they're using the NFSI B101.3 standards. And wanted to spend just a minute talking about standards because they oftentimes can be very confusing. Every country seems to believe they're doing it the best. Interestingly, when I took on this role of developing standards, I looked around the world and assumed other people were perhaps doing it better than we were in the United States, and found a device, tribometer made in Germany. It was called the FSC 2000 floor slide control. It then became Americanized, as I'd like to say, and the NFSI started to market and sell the device as the Universal Walkway Tester, or the UWT 3000. And of course, it went through a few reiterations, and it's now known as the TrackScan. And so that technology has been around many, many years, but it was a imported technology. So if there's a better way to identify a potential slip hazard by way of testing, that's always been my goal, not to assume somehow we do it the best and we'll always do it the best. There may be better ways. And the reason I asked the question earlier about difficulty of testing is the approach we've taken is we want to make testing fast and easy and inexpensive, and frankly, something that many of your customers can do either themselves or bringing you in and having a test performed literally in a matter of seconds. There's very little setup, very little downtime. You're not in anybody's way. And so the approach we took is speed and performance and accuracy, all the above. And and I'm just curious whether or not, as we're saying, American companies abroad widely using the B101.3 standard, that would perhaps be attractive in the UK. And then secondly, how these standards all get used. I mean, we can argue which is more important: SCOF, DCOF, wet, dry, which sensors, which device. I mean, every country seems to just dig their heels in and think they're doing it better, and they really find it. I find it difficult. They have discussions around the subject when, for example, you mentioned HSC. When I met with them a number of years ago, just having a dialogue in the UK on the subject, they got very defensive. It was very much, we do it the best. The pendulum is the best device that's ever been invented. I mean, I guess it came with Moses, and therefore it's holy. And they were just very close-minded to wanting to adopt new ideas, new approaches. And again, it's not to insult the pendulum. It's just it does have significant drawbacks. And you mentioned it. Portability. It's a big. I mean, they claim to be portable, but it's like carrying a small refrigerator around with you and saying, it's portable.
It's a big bit of kit. Yeah,
it's interesting. It's a big box. And it takes a lot of room. You need a lot of space, a lot of clearance. And so those are the downsides. But as far as standards go, at the end of the day, is there any movement in the UK as far as maybe adopting different standards or using other standards?
I mean, I'm not I've not come from this, as you know, from a scientific background. So I think there are certain people, maybe perhaps within the HSE or ex-HSE, and maybe some of the forensic engineers that are coming from this from a very, very scientific, boffin kind of perspective. And lots of my fellow members of the UK slip resistance group would be more on that side of the coin than me. I'm coming at it from a pragmatic, practical perspective. And my view on all of this is really that, if we can find something that people can use that's accurate enough, and then we can get them to do testing regularly enough so that they can start to see some trends, that's where the value comes in. So I would always advise people in the UK, because of the fact that the HSE stipulates the pendulum, that you should do pendulum testing. But if you've got another test that you can use yourself on a frequent basis, and you can put the two side by side and get a benchmark and get a line in the sand. So almost forget what the number is that the other test produces, but whatever that number is, whether it's 20 or 30 or 7,632, it doesn't matter. But if you then test that floor in the same location the week after and you get the same number, okay, well, that means things are staying the same. Test it again the week after, it's staying the same. And only then, if you start to see variance in the testing numbers, that's when you know that either things are getting a bit better or a bit worse, and then you can try and take some action, again, pragmatically, to try and reduce the risk. So, I do think that it's going to be difficult to change, just because I know how it works. It'd be difficult to change people's minds on the pendulum in the UK, but that's not to say that, another test that would be quicker, easier, better couldn't have a role to be used by the building manager or the cleaning contractor or whoever it might be, because the more we can do to educate people that this is important and they should be doing something to track what's going on, and if there's an issue, improve the situation and not just bury their heads in the sand, the better that's going to be for everyone.
Yeah, I agree. I am familiar with the health and safety organization, HSC, as well as the slip resistance group. In fact, I was invited to deliver a presentation at the slip resistant group, Spain, in Madrid this past February, and I will be attending the upcoming slip resistance group meeting in the UK this June. So I'll actually be seeing you there.
We can go for a beer.
There we go. We can go for a nice cold beer, which your beer is never as cold as ours for some reason, but it's good nonetheless. Where I really want to kind of end this discussion is on training. We have a walkway auditor certificate holder, or WACH, W-A-C-H, course here in the U.S. It's very, very popular. We've been doing that for many years. I think we have 400 or 500 certified, or what used to be known as certified walkway auditors. We now call them walkway auditor certificate holders. It's a professional designation, and we find that training, not selling, but training, teaching the consumer, or in your case, prospective customer, about their problem, or just the problem in general of slips, trips, and falls, goes a long way in helping them make better, I guess, smarter, more informed decisions. It's oftentimes been said that having a educated consumer is the best potential customer, because they know what their problem is. Where you can't really convince somebody of a problem that they don't really understand. But how important do you think training, or I should say, how important is training in the UK on this subject? And is anybody doing slip, trip, and fall prevention training?
Well, firstly, I fully agree with your point about the education of the consumer, and that's kind of what I spend my life doing. So if anybody is connected with me on LinkedIn, or wants to connect with me on LinkedIn, what they'll see is a raft of educational content, from videos to articles to digital tools that people can do themselves, which are hosted on the website. And it's all about trying to educate people about how important this is, and the fact that there are practical and pragmatic solutions that really do work to reduce the risk. So fully on board with you on that point. In terms of the training side, I think that is one of the pitfalls in the UK, because, as I said, we've got the UK Slip Resistance Group, and we put together the guidelines on how to use the pendulum, and they're published and they're available for use, but there's nobody monitoring that those are being implemented correctly by people out in the field that are actually using the pendulum. And so, that does introduce a certain level of risk, particularly where you have companies who are, I guess, competitors of mine, who are providing a service to offer remedial works to improve floors, whether that's cleaning or treating or whatever it might be. And there's always a element of doubt in the customer's mind, I think, around the validity of the results, because if you turn up to a site and you test 6 or 7 floor areas and they're all very slippery when wet, that always, I don't like a visit like that. I prefer a visit, if I'm going and doing testing, where I can show the client, different types of surfaces that achieve different results. So I'll even, if I'm finding that I'm testing loads of their floors and they're all giving a high slip risk when wet, I'll often take them outside onto the pavement and say, look, I just want to show you here that if you test this different floor that's actually very slip resistant, you get a much better result, because it's important that they can see the validity of the test. So I think there is a challenge there. We sort of get around that, for want of a better term, by the relationships that we've got, and the fact that a lot of our business comes through our partners, like the insurance companies and the floor manufacturers and some of these blue chip clients. And my business and my reputation is everything to me, so we're never going to do anything that's untoward. But that doesn't necessarily mean that couldn't be done by other people potentially. So I think there should be an opportunity to do something like that, but it's figuring out who would be the right people to take that ball and run with it.
Well, I agree. And the world is a changing place. And the subject matter that we're discussing, slip, trip, and fall prevention, is one of paramount importance, because the problem is of paramount importance. Many people die, and even more are injured as a result of a slip, trip, and fall. And as I like to say, as long as there's gravity, people will fall. And so there is an interest, though, in exchanging information. They have an international exchange with different countries to see what approaches they take. Because frankly, if you're doing something better than we are, we certainly would like to hear about it. And that's just, I guess, a cultural difference that the NFSI has versus others in the United States, where we tend to think that perhaps there are other people that can do this a little bit better than we do, and really look to experts across the pond. But we've been speaking with Christian Harris from Slip Safety Services out of London, England. And how could somebody get in touch with you, Christian?
So, as I mentioned, I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. So if you were to search for Christian Harris Slip Safety, you would almost certainly find me on there. The other good place to get hold of us or me is on the website, which is slipsafety.co.uk, so .co.uk. And there you'll find, as I said, lots
Wonderful.
of content.
One of the things.
So go ahead.
Well, no, I was just going to say one of the things I found of real value on your website was your safety scorecard. And we liked it so much that we're working with you on actually having you make some changes to it to really approach the Address the American issue and put it on the NFSI website. So before I let you go, I want you to put a little plug in for your safety scorecard and how you put that together on your website.
Yeah, happy to do that. I've got a couple of digital diagnostic tools, and that's one. The other one I've got is, which I'll touch on first, is around specification. So this helps to try and solve the problem of what level of slip resistance do I need in a kitchen versus in a hotel bathroom versus in a bathtub versus on a poolside. So there's a tool there where you can answer a couple of questions and it'll give you some guidance, which again is focused on the UK, but it'll give you an idea of a traffic light system of high, moderate, and low, red, orange, and green. The slip safety scorecard, the idea behind this is that my view is there are 6 factors which determine whether somebody slips or not. And I've come up with an acronym for that called CHIMES. So it's contamination. So in other words, if a floor is clean and dry, nobody's going to slip. Heel, so the footwear element of things. Individual, so thinking about if we're pushing, pulling, twisting, turning, we need more friction than if we're just walking in a straight line. Or if we're distracted, we're more likely to slip and fall because we're not going to see a hazard. M is for maintenance, so all around the cleaning of the surface and how the surface changes over time through wear and tear. E is environment, so things like the weather, condensation, lighting, steps and stairs, slopes, and so on. And S, the surface, so the floor, how slip resistant is the floor. And the scorecard basically runs through about 40 questions, which are kind of yes/no answers. And then it gives you a score and a personalized report based on each of those 6 factors. So you'll get a percentage for contamination and a percentage for heel and so on and so forth. And then it runs through some tips on what you can do, again, in a practical sense, to improve your score on each of those and kind of compare yourself up to what's best practice. So we've had some very good feedback from it. People, seem to find it pretty useful, and it's a good guidance for, starting out your journey in terms of, I think I may have a problem here. Spend 10 minutes, answer these questions. I get a report. Okay, well, this was going to highlight where maybe my problems are more so than other areas. Let's put some time into that.
No, it's a wonderful diagnostic tool. And like I said, we're going to work with you on bringing that here to the United States, to the NFSI. But the last thing I wanted to let you know is many years ago when I was running the Traction Plus company in the early 90s, the Queen Mom, the Queen's mother of England, had slipped and fallen and I think broke her hip, early 1990s. And we had sent some product over to Buckingham Palace to safety treat some of the bathtubs, and wound up getting an order from from the Queen and shipped product to the UK. So we safety treated, or I safety treated many years ago, the bathtubs in the Royal Palace, and got this lovely hand-signed letter from the Queen thanking me for help. Yeah, it was pretty neat. So we have it framed but so I have a little experience safety treating bathtubs in the UK, and so there's a connection.
I've never met the Queen, but I went to university with Prince William and his now wife, and I never saw him slip over, but I did see him in the pub a few times, perhaps having had a few too many drinks, and almost had a tumble. But or perhaps that's because I had too many drinks and I misremembered it. But yeah.
That must have been a few years ago, huh?
Yes, I know. Yeah, before the grey hairs, which are the grey hairs and the expanding waistline. But there we go.
Well, I appreciate you spending the time with me today, and we're probably going to have you back. I'd like to carry this conversation on. I'm going to be doing more international interviews in the upcoming seasons to give a broader understanding of the scope of the problem and potential solutions, and just the viewpoint of others like yourself that are professionals that are involved in this industry and have a certain perspective that's worthy of sharing with my audience. So I may bring you back again.